I think for a lot of us who grew up in the late 70s and 80s, Star Wars has a special place in our heart. And for me, I'm no exception. Always like to tell the story that my dad, even on the day I was born in 1977, went to go see Star Wars after I was born that day, which in and of itself may have been a problem, but it is what it is. But I've always thought that I had a special kinship with the film. And growing up, when we moved from place to place, from Kentucky to Louisiana to Tennessee to Kentucky, it was sometimes difficult to find friends. But I could always find friendship in a galaxy far, far away. And maybe in some ways, the idea of Star Wars helped to inspire my interest and love of history. There was always this idea of this past, right? When Obi-Wan Kenobi is talking about for 1,000 generations, Jedi were the guardians of peace and justice in the Republic before the dark times, before the Empire. And there's always this illusion of this other history, this other stories that kind of draw you in. There was this trust that George Lucas built in with the viewers about this other past. And of course, time moves on. We watch our series, we watch our movies, we go to graduate school, we become grown-up historians. And I was fortunate enough to meet two other scholars who are just as passionate about Star Wars as I am. And while their passion is equal to mine, their brilliance as scholars as far surpasses my own. And what I'm excited about today is introducing all of you to two dear friends of mine, Alejandra Dubcovsky and Alan Malfavon now. Alejandra and Alan are awesome and amazing, and they work in the Spanish borderlands throughout North America, and you'll hear that us talking about that a little bit later in our conversation today. But they're amazing folks, and I really think you guys are going to love this conversation where we go with it. We do end up ranking these movies, which takes a whole lot of time when you consider there's like 1,000 of them at this point in time. And I think you're really going to dig the talk today. So join in. We're going to do Star Wars and talk about how we can use Star Wars to teach history. Next on the Historians of the Movies podcast. And welcome to the Historians of the Movies podcast. I am your host, Jason Herbert. I'm the creator of Historians of the Movies, allegedly the longest running watch party on the internet. And I'm totally geeked out today because I got two of my absolute favorite people in the entire world to talk to you guys about my favorite movie in the entire world, which is Star Wars. So I want to introduce both of these people here to you guys because people, that sounds so weird. I never know like what word. Humans, both of these humans to historians, is that word? Yeah, okay, whatever. All right, so we're going to jump in. Alejandra Dubcovsky is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Riverside. She's also the inaugural fellow in the Program for the Advancement of the Humanities, a partnership of the Huntington and UC Riverside that aims to support the future of the humanities. She received her BA and PhD from UC Berkeley, and she has a master's in library and information science from San Jose State. Her first book is like the smartest thing I've ever freaking read, ever. You can't see her right now, but I'm telling you, she hates when I do this. But oh my God, you guys, you have to read this thing. It's called Informed Power Communication in the Early American South. It won other big awards from people who also think it's crazy smart, such as the Michael V.R. Thomason Book Award from the Gulf South Historical Association. And she's got this other book that's going to be like insanely just crazy that I'm just like, I don't even want to read it because I will feel bad. I will cower under my sheets, whimpering and crying while I don't have words. But her words, the title of this is going to be Talking Back Native Women and the Making of the Early South. And it's going to be released by Oxford University Press in May 2023. So hopefully we'll get her back to talk like Empire Strikes Back or like something else between now and then, because I'm so geeked out about it. And now that I've like bragged all over Alejandra, I want to introduce Alan Malfavon, who is Assistant professor of history at Washington State University. And he's a historian of the late colonial and early independent Latin America. And he also has a book that will also make me cry. Really, this is turning into things that make Jason cry. I feel like what was the movie with like Sally Field where everyone cries when Julia Roberts dies?
Steel Magnolia.
Steel Magnolias. That's what you guys are. You're the Steel Magnolias of American history, or of the America's history. Because Alan's first book, Men of Leeward Port, Veracruz's Afro-Descendants in the Making of Mexico, is under contract with the University of Alabama Press, and it focuses on the understudied Afro-Mexican population of Veracruz and its hinterland of Sotavento, Leeward, and uses it to reframe the historical and historiographical transition between the colonial and national period. And Alejandra, welcome to Historians of the Movies podcast. I'm so glad you guys are here.
Thank you so much. This is so exciting. I feel like talking about Star Wars is a peak career move for me. There's nowhere else to go now.
I got to second Alejandra's comment on that. To me, this is like a CV defining moment for me, actually.
I know, right? So we're like spend all this time like researching and writing, and like Alejandra like speaks like 45 languages, and we do all this stuff, and then for our career, we're like, it'd be great if we could talk about Star Wars, which is totally the whole idea. Because I mean, so the foundation, like when like we all came to like I came to know the two of you several years ago. Alejandra, you had invited me out to like this seminar that we were doing. This first what's right where we went.
It was a graduate student workshop.
Yeah, it's a graduate student workshop right at the Huntington, right, and that's where I met Alan. And it was the very first one of its kind on the borderlands. I remember it's out at the Huntington out in California. If you guys aren't familiar with the Huntington Library, it's this like insanely, just amazingly beautiful place. I have a few different memories of that place. One was meeting you guys for the first time. I was sick the whole time because like I'd just flown out from Florida and like everything in California was dry. And then having to beg like the chefs over there to make me something without mayonnaise. Everything had aioli on it. I remember. These are the things I take away.
I'm so glad that the intensive.
Yeah, I remember. But wasn't Dan Richter there? He was like asking me what the stakes of my he was like, so what's the stake? I was giving a presentation on cattle. And he's like, so what's the stakes of your argument? I was like, okay, I'm gonna die right here in front of everybody. But like anyway, so aside from that, like we ended up like I didn't know this at the time, but we were all like were and are just giant Star Wars nerds.
Yes.
And that's like been a foundation to our friendship. But if I can step away for a second from like Star Wars, and we're going to spend a whole lot of time talking Star Wars. What's the borderlands? Like for somebody who's like, doesn't know, like people are like, what's American history? Or like, what's maritime? What's the borderlands? We talk about like borderlands history, frontier history. Alejandra and I both work in indigenous Florida. Alan, you work in Mexico, but all of our work is kind of influenced by these ideas of borderlands history. So maybe we could kind of like jump in because so much of Star Wars is actually about the frontier, right? We talk about it, especially like Tatooine is outer rim. We know this is like borderlands. We know this is a frontier. So maybe we can jump in there. Like what's frontier? What's borderlands history?
Yeah, I mean, I do a different type of borderlands because I kind of think of the ocean, Atlantic world, and the Greater Caribbean as this kind of like what Ernesto Bassi called the aqueous territory, right? This malleable, changing, fluid type of landscape, right? Where a frontier is not just gun ho, the West, David Weber type of situation, but it's actually tangible, right? And it's actually within preconceived notions of borders, right? Like of, the Spanish Empire or the French Caribbean, right? That the peoples within that space, through manipulating of the systems they live in, they actually make a borderland themselves, right? So I think I'd like to think my work takes the borderland and changes it a little bit from its traditional continental aspects. I would say the traditional concept of the borderland is that of the settlement expansion of the U.S. continental West, the U.S.-Mexico border, particularly the Southwest as well, the Pacific Northwest, of course, not to forget that. And it often involves this kind of different factors, right? European colonization, indigenous peoples, African descendants, as well as big players of the borderland, right? But the borderland is this tangible, fluid, and not really a structured place. I would say it's the borderland for me.
Yeah, I think when we think of borderlands, we think of spaces literally between two sovereign nations or two places that have state and recognized power that can defend that territory. So we think of borders as the space right between them, right? Our minds, especially here being in California, we think of being the border between Mexico and California, literally a physical frontier that divides two sovereign countries. And so we think about borderlands, I think the more backwards in time you go, especially when you're looking at American history, as these spaces, right, in between imperial claims. But we all know, right, we all study the very earlier time periods, that these claims are more imaginary than real. The real boundaries are defined by the people who are on the ground. Those people happen to be indigenous. They also have their own borders and boundaries and sets of states. So borderlands is, I think, a short way historians have really tried to put a quick label on these in-between spaces that are not quite European. They're not quite any more autonomous indigenous because they have constant pressures from other European powers. And so it's the spaces that are in between. And oftentimes interesting things happen to power and to, just like we're going to get in the Star Wars universe, a lot of different characters seem to congregate in these nodes because they're right at the intersections of these spaces where we assume state power still holds. But I think that's the question, is who has power in these spaces? How is that power defined? Who gets to control the border and the like? So borderlands has been a great question for, at least for U.S. historians, as U.S. imperialism has pushed sort of a westward and then imperial, as Alan's mentioning, right, aquatic as well, into the borders. Who controls these spaces? And then how do we tell those histories? From which perspectives, right? From standing in those spaces and looking at the invading forces, from the invading forces perspectives and the like. So I think that for me is the exciting part of thinking about borderlands.
All three of us do borderlands stuff in some fashion, right? And we all got into history at some point in time because we were just in addition to Star Wars things, I think it's fair to say we're just giant nerds.
Yep.
And I say this in the most endearing possible way.
I'm proud of that.
Absolutely, right? But like in all of the history that you could be doing, why now? Like, why the time period? Why borderlands? Why this instead of, say, any number of other fields? What was it that drew you specifically to like your particular topics? Did you have the moment where you're like, this is my jam? This is where I want to be?
Oh, I mean, I think all of us fall. I think there's just always a serendipity. There's always like going left and then right and then ending up where we go. For me, it was honestly a conjunction of asking questions that led me to think about the movement of enslaved people of African descent that were enslaved, and then realizing that my expertise, which I to this day, I don't think it's an expertise, knowing to read and write Spanish, like there's 25 countries, millions of people all over the world who know how to do this. I never thought of it as a special expertise, but here in U.S. history, that added an ability. So being able to read Spanish and French sources, again, just as I was saying, whose perspectives we are able to tell. And as the story kept going forward for me, thinking about indigenous history and how we tell that story, how we work with those languages. So for me, falling into borderlands was about getting to tell different kind of stories than the ones I had heard, different kinds of way of reconceptualizing who matters and where they matter in U.S. history. And it was just so exciting. It just honestly felt more open and less historiographically dense. And by that, I just mean there are periods of time like the Civil War or the American Revolution that a lot of scholars like focus on and work on. So when you write on them, you tend to just be able to be like, getting into a little nook and say, I'm fighting with this person, I'm agreeing with that person, but here's my little contribution. And I think that that's great, but that requires a level of, I felt like, intellect that I was like, I cannot get into these debates. I don't care. I want to tell these spaces and stories that just feel like there's a lot of stories and voices that are clamoring to be told in many ways. And I thought, oh, this is so cool. I want to be able to tell stories. And the Borderlands seemed like a space that really needed that and needed them. Again, I know I'm going to repeat this a lot because I think it's really linked to Star Wars, is whose story are we telling and why, to me is not just a question of, it's a question of methods, right? It's not just like the history and stories we're telling, but how we tell them and what they mean. So for me, that was always the exciting part about Borderlands, is that those methods questions were being embedded into the narrative questions and like who we and how we tell the stories. And I have a lot of more reasons why, why Florida from California is such a mistake, but it's so wonderful. It's the best. It's the coolest. You're not going to convince me any otherwise. I love it.
Listen, this is all about like fighting with Alan today, because he's already like had the blaster shots fired across that we're going to get into this Weber thing in a moment.
I feel like Han Solo right now, like dodging Greedo's shots in the special editions with you two like aiming shots at me. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, well, first of all, we don't acknowledge the special editions, nor, since this is my podcast, do we acknowledge the sequels. But go on, Alan. I don't want to talk all over you. What I mean, because you and I, one of the things like when you and I became friends, right? You would just like wax poetic about Veracruz. Like I was like, and I still haven't been over there, but I still very much want to go, because like one of the things that endeared me to you when we became friends was like you would just talk about Veracruz in these ways. And I was like, God, man, this place sounds amazing. So like, why?
That's an excellent question, Jason. Thank you for thinking out talk about my homeland in a wax poetic way. That's a very very nice way of
Dude, you
complimenting.
really do. You say these things about this place, and I'm just like, gosh, I want to see it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the ways I look at Borderlands history, to be quite frank with you, Latin American historians don't really use Borderlands history as much as early American historians, right? Because we tend to fall into the fallacy, I call it the fallacy of the colonial nation state, right? And by that I mean the empire, right? And the borders of the empire and a shared territory. But I think that Veracruz is a very interesting place. Number one, it's a port city, right? So people are moving in and out all the time for 300 years of the colonial period. Number two, it's a tropical coastal lowland that was in the colonial period full of disease like malaria and yellow fever. So a lot less Europeans, much more African populations and mixed indigenous populations as well, right? So it's this kind of like malleable place as well, right? It's the port of entry to a whole empire that it's assumed, right, that we control it. But I came to understand in many ways by doing research here that it was actually African descendants that really controlled the place, unbeknownst to the Spaniards. And when the Spaniards figure out that this was a problem, it was too late to confront it, and they had to come to terms and agreements with these peoples. And I thought that super interesting, right? How an entire population of subalterns, right, quote unquote. By that word, I mean peoples are under the elites, right, under the power of coloniality, end up actually in the backdrop controlling politically or socially, economically the area. And to me, that seemed like a very unexplored avenue of history that I really wanted to do with a city. Obviously, as you guys know, I grew up there. My dad's from there. My roots are from there. And also, it became kind of like a need for me to discover my own personal family history, right? My great grandmother was Afro-Mexican and her blackness was always denied. And it was this kind of myth that her family was from Cuba. And I went through some family records and it turned out that her family is actually centuries deep from Mandinga, which was a village founded by Maroons in the 17th century, right? So there's all these dynamics and echoes of history, right? That under these constructs of nation state, nationality, right? Mexican is who is Mexican, who belongs, who doesn't. This blackness gets forgotten. And I think the port city represented this very not just cultural, but very political and social avenue to explore the lives of peoples whose stories have been silenced or neglected. And that's why I think I love the history of that port city so much.
Okay, so you guys were both talking about methodology and the way of studies and these relationships and things like that. There's one of the things I actually want to address here because there's another thing I haven't like led on here yet, which is the relationship between the two of you, which I actually think is fascinating because I wanted to because this is an opportunity to really kind of talk about like the making of history and then frankly the making of historians, which is that Alan, you studied under Alejandra, right?
That is correct. In Star Wars talk, I was her Padawan and she was my Jedi Master.
Yeah, right. So I kind of wonder, and we don't have to go like crazy deep on this, but for people who are not familiar with like how historians get trained as you coming up as a scholar and things like that, I just wanted to like kind of pull back the curtain just a little bit on that and talk a little bit about this like Jedi, Padawan, or knowing the two of you like I do, Sith. Relationship. So if I can, if it's okay, what I would like to like talk about just briefly is the idea of like, so when you go to get your PhD and so forth, most people get their bachelor's and then their master's and then go to a program and so forth. And you're kind of shopping around trying to figure out what school am I going to go to or where can I go to? So, Alan, you got your PhD from UC Riverside under Alejandra, under her tutelage or mentorship. Maybe it's the right word. Like, why, if I can, why UC Riverside? Can you talk a little bit about like what that was like? Why choosing to go there, and then what it was like to like have someone also working in Borderlands and so forth?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Jason. I mean, UC Riverside, number one, there were always two choices for me in my grad school path or career. It's funny because I had actually been accepted to UT Austin before Riverside. I mean, we all know the great program at Latin American history at UT Austin. I have many colleagues that are great dear friends of mine that came out of there. But I saw in UC Riverside something special compared to UT Austin, and that was the mentorship and the quality of mentorship and the closeness of mentor and student that we had at UC Riverside. It felt also like an institution that could represent me, a first generation migrant scholar, better than going to this really prestigious in the field institution. And when I met Alejandra, when she came into work, I was working under another professor, Dr. Robert Patch, now emeritus, great professor in Yucatan. But to be quite frank, I felt like my research needed a push, right? Because it could have been very easy to be comfortable and stay in a Mexicanist perspective, right? And you stay there and get a dissertation done, and that's it. But knowing Alejandra and taking her, if I believe correct, Alejandra, it was your Native Americans history from the 1500s. Well, actually, way back, right? We read the book about 5000 BCE all the way to the 1800s. It gave me that perspective, right, about the possibilities of expanding my research and do this transnational, transfield approach to history. And I just asked Alejandra one day, and could you become my mentor? And she gladly accepted. And I remember it was right before I moved to Mexico and Spain to do archival research, and Alejandra was instrumental in that. So in many ways, yes, it is like in the Star Wars universe, master and apprentice relationship, right?
But hopefully I'm a better teacher than some of the Jedis we've seen on the screen. Man, these guys need a pedagogy class. Holy crap. I'm just like, Luke, take a class on teaching and do some pair share and report out and get some callback and maybe get some evaluation and assessment before you keep training people who try to murder everyone. So I really hope that's not what I've created or helped create. But I think it's a relationship, right? And it's mentoring, and it's something that grows. And I was super lucky it goes both ways, right? Alan speaks about how lucky he was that I took him on. And honestly, I was just like, please want to work with me. It goes both ways. You learn so much. These are relationships that you build on each other, and you support, right? The strength of the person. We have similar interests in telling stories of underrepresented people, doing it, in ethical ways, which sounds like a really low baseline to have to clear. But believe it or not, in academia, we've just cleared a pretty high bar together. I see everyone nodding. But beyond that sort of bar, then we had to learn a lot from each other, from our styles, from who we are. It's going to shock you. I'm a very easily excitable person. So I can be like very quick. And so, it's a process of learning how I work, how Alan works, and how to work together. And, I get still very cringy when, you can tell I have kids that I say the word cringe, right? I have no idea what that word really means. That you are supposed to call students like your students, and we still do that. And I get very uncomfortable when people say, "Who are your students?" And I said, "I don't have any." They're their own person, and I support their work. And I know that's more of a mouthful, and that's not quite the easy way to do it. And it's much easier to say, "Oh yeah, I work under Alejandra or work," but that's not true, though, right? That they're their own person, and you support. And I always emphasize to Alan that it requires a team. So I can be there, I can answer every email, I can go, but at the end of the day, I'm just one person, and you're going to need other perspectives. You're going to need another voice. And he was great getting that, right? So I always felt like he and I helped build his team. And I think that's how you survive academia, right? You have a team of people who are going to go up to bat for you. And I think all the Star Wars metaphors are there too, right? But you're not by yourself. This is not a one-on-one forever and ever, for better and worse, right? So if you love your mentor, or if you don't like your mentor, there's all these alternatives in grad school, because it's a weird, it's often an arranged marriage. You show up to a program and you're like, I hope this person that I agreed to work with is nice, or not just nice, but matches me, right? Their insanity and my insanity works well together. And sometimes that happens and it's great. And sometimes it doesn't, but it works in other ways. So I think, it's a dance. It's a wonderful. And for me, it was like, it's such a privilege to be part of that team.
Yeah, it's awesome, because I talk so much to people, and because for graduate students and people maybe who are listening to this and so forth, so much of the choice to attend XYZ university is actually based upon choosing, you don't go to the university of wherever, you actually go to the university of whomever, right? In a lot of ways, you're choosing to align yourself with your advisor, the discipline, how they choose. Certainly my advisor was very heavily instrumental in like how I chose I was like, this guy's going to push me, right? It's like he does things a little differently than I've gone to, and like that'll help develop me, right? Because you wanted to step out of like your strengths and and so forth. But in some cases, like you find that sometimes it doesn't; those things don't work out, and somebody will arrive on campus, and I've talked to graduate students like via Twitter and things like that. They're like, I arrived here at this school, and like, what do I do now? And you push through, or something like that, or like Alan was just kind of talking about, or in Alejandra, you were too, right? You assemble like your squad of people. Either your colleagues, people in your cohort as graduate students, or people outside, because they do become so like important. You've got to have your band of, we're gonna go band of Jedi.
I was gonna say your Rogue One squad, but maybe that's
your Rogue One squad. Okay, that's fair. So we are gonna rank Star Wars movies later on tonight, right? Okay. I mean that's gonna happen from a historical perspective. I feel like the fight is coming. Like I feel the tension over Weber. You guys keep like who Weber? Why is he Batman? No, he's not. But all right, people have been waiting. Like, all right, history people talk about movies now, right? So, all right, let's just jump in. Why Star Wars? We have this we all have this like love of this film. For the record, we're talking about technically A New Hope, but I'm like just Star Wars in general. I don't care.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just go, especially if we're talking about the Holy Trilogy. Alejandra, you talked a lot, like when we were talking beforehand, about you teach this film.
My goal has been to integrate as much analogies with Star Wars as possible. I've done it successfully when I talk about archives to talk about Star Wars, but this year in my methodology class, I was able to add a whole example of Star Wars when talking about how historians make arguments. And so I feel like very slowly but surely, I will be able to design a whole history course, and the bulk of my examples rely on Star Wars. But why Star Wars? I mean, they're just I mean, for me, it was one of the first like sort of big films that I saw. I saw them all. I don't know about Alan, but I saw them all in Spanish. So I saw them in terrible dubbed Spanish from Spain. I had the same thing. I then heard Diego Luna give an interview about Andor and talking about how he always saw R2D2 was Arturito, like little Arthur, because of the Spanish. I literally still have this conversation with my mom. She's like, no, it's not. And like no amount of proof will convince her otherwise, So for me, it was just like, it was magic. It was a magical movie. I thought Luke Skywalker was like the cutest person ever. My little self was gonna, be Mrs. Luke Skywalker. And then later in life, I was like, I don't have to be Mrs. Luke. I could be Luke Skywalker. I could have the lightsaber. Screw this guy. So I went through this whole, the whole phase. And I just thought for me, they were just a great fun and great escape. And it was much later than like the different things came added to them. But it is a movie. It is a movie I will put on when I'm having a bad day, when I know where it is a movie that will go on no matter what. And about once a year, I go through this like crisis where I decide maybe the prequels weren't that bad. My husband knows this about me. And so once a year, I will rewatch these movies, and he is like, we've done this. And I think it's about every other year. And it's a sort of, for me, they're a safety net. They're something I go back to. I just get really into them, into the universe that they produce. And yeah, and I get to nerd out. I get very angry about really little details and have long conversations about things.
Oh, good, because that's what we're here for. We just pick up like little bitty details like the entire sequel trilogy.
Yep.
And just roid out. But before we do that, Alan, what about you? Like, why Star Wars? Like, does this appeal to the historian in you? Because I saw you nodding your head, like let's just create an entire class called the History of Star Wars, or like let's go. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, no, thank you. Before I continue though, I'm gonna have to stop your slander of the prequels, my friend, because as I think like Star Wars is very much a generational thing, right? And without giving my age away, I grew up with the prequels, right? And that to me was my Star Wars, right? And I get it. Script episode 2, horrible dialogue. I get it, right? We get it. You don't like sand. You get it. We get it, right? But for the world building, I think to me the prequels feel like one of those hefty 1960s historiographies, right? With so much complex details and so much politics, right? That just like your head is pounding from this whole historiographies that you're reading, but yet they're so rich with content, right? And they're, I think, so needed to contextualize what comes after. Eventually, when we talk from a historical perspective about Star Wars, right, how the Empire was created, I mean, the prequels are, I would argue, essential in that regard, and that is the kind of trilogy that shaped me. And I remember I grew up in Veracruz, and I saw them like Alejandra in Spanish with a Mexican Latin American dub. Thankfully, I didn't have to see them in Castellano, because otherwise it would have been a completely different experience. But I remember being, I believe, 7, 8 when like episode 1 came out, and the moment that I saw Qui-Gon Jinn and young Obi-Wan Kenobi just walking right in this really simple clothes with their hoods, and just this dynamic, right, of master and apprentice, and I was like, I want that, right? I want to be mentored like that, and I want to be that secure, that self-confident, right? And it's just not only magic, right, but it's also a way of escapism, right, of many of the problems that were happening around me, my country, and all of that. And in many ways, when I migrated to the States, one of the cultural references, right, that connected me with new friendships, and even if I was speaking English now, was Star Wars, right? And it was that like cultural relativity. I was able to engage with new people here in California, where I'm currently staying the day on today. Yeah, I mean, it's just like a pop culture phenomena that has marked my life. And in many ways, whenever I see something, right, like when Palpatine takes over and creates the Empire, I was like, oh, Julius Caesar, right? I'm like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Leonardo DiCaprio just like pointing at the screen and things like that, right? Or like, for example, the clone troopers turning on the Jedi. I'm like, oh, look, like fascist Germany or fascist Italy, right? The rise of fascism, right? And I think those movies still have some historical echoes that can be very helpful for the world we're living in today.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think Lucas was really on to a lot of different things. I think that in a lot of ways, like this prequels will suffer because Lucas didn't have anyone around him to help him shape these larger points he was trying to make. It feels like they just published the first draft of the screenplay in a lot of ways, because you can see where Lucas is trying to go with that kind of stuff. There's parts where he misses out, where he completely destroys the idea of the mysticism of the Force via the midichlorians and things like that. But you understand where he's trying to get at these ideas like virgin birth, all these different stuff, pod races. Obviously, he's trying to recreate this, Greco-Roman world of so forth. So you see where it's at. But I do want to go ahead and I know we talked about the ageism and things like that. Sir, I waited in line 26 hours for episode 1. 26 hours in Murray, Kentucky. I was the first person in the theater. This is 1999, so it's pre-checking on the internet. I think we barely have an internet back then. But you actually do bring up a good point, Alejandra, Alan, that I actually want to ask Alejandra about, which is with the vast majority of our students in the college classroom now are 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. There obviously some different folks. When you say Star Wars, what is their point of reference?
That's a great question.
So I have this moment where we were talking. I was talking to someone and they said, "Oh, I love Star Wars. I love the original." And they were, "I love the old ones." And I was like, "Oh yeah, me too." And we were talking. And then all of a sudden, I said, "Wait. When you say the old ones, what do you mean? Because I'm here, in 1977, I'm here in my head, with hairstyles and, two old men hitting themselves with a stick and, talking Alec Guinness." And he's like, "Oh, the ones with Jar Jar." And I had this sort of moment of how old am I, but I think, my students who know them, and this is actually how I use the argument in my class. The prequels, yes, but those are old. So I think the Star Wars that exists are the cartoons that have come that, I have much less experience with, but those are sort of foundational, what they watched when they were young. And then sort of now the movies that are coming out now, like the 7, 8, 9, as well as the spin-offs that are related. So those are their Star Wars, universe that is existing. So for me, it was great. So this is how I used it just very recently in my class. We were talking about how historians make arguments. And I said, and, I was going through different examples. So one of them is historians are really good at making additive arguments that expand a particular point in a particular thing that's said. Someone has said this was the cause of something, and someone says, yes, that is, and this other thing as well. Historians are very good at expanding arguments. And I think students get that to a point. But so then, of course, I use Star Wars as my leading. We said we had this one little point in, this one point of contention, right, that of what is Rogue One, but an expansion of one particular question that then gets answered by the other one. And I had so many students afterwards. I'm like, I get it. I get it. And I said, and additive histories, I said, and here I can get ready to fight, but I'm willing to defend this standpoint. Additive history, right, can seem small because it's adding one little thing, but it can produce things, magical things, like Darth Vader entering that scene in the end of Rogue One, which is just the most badass scene, the most awesome scene I've been waiting for in my life. And you get that scene with an additive moment. So I feel like oftentimes historians, so I was able to explain all that and the payoffs in a very clear way, thanks to Star Wars. So, but for my students, it's a very contemporary understanding. It's not even the prequels, Alan, you're old now. It's not even those, it's what comes, and not even what came before. It's the thing happening now, and the Disney Plus series that are as a result.
Do either of you have a particular moment or a theme in particular that really resonates with you? Because I think we've got different themes really in the original trilogy, and then the prequel trilogy, which I think gets a lot more political as we move forward. And then and then there was another trilogy that was made.
Oh my God!
Listen, I love my children too much to let them watch a sequel trilogy. I'm just going to go ahead and put this out there. If you're pro sequel trilogy, this is not your day. So, All right, themes of these films. I mean, what resonates with you?
I mean, I think for me, for the originals, is like the hero's journeys arc that then gets a little bit more, and then like how that arc that's so simple in the first one becomes muddied because this sort of dichotomy between dark side and light side, good and bad, is actually far more muddied than we think it is. So I love that. I love that it's a simple, I remember my English teacher was like, this is a movie. If you ever want to explain hero's journey to anyone, show Star Wars. It has all the like 7 steps or whatever. I can't remember in my English class. But then like if you continue on in this journey with this hero, it becomes a little bit more interesting. So for me, I always like I like my life to be very simple and straightforward, but I like all my characters and my movies to live the complications out for me. And I think for me that the grayness, I'm always really attracted to that character that's a little bit, that becomes more complex. That life shows them that in fact this really even visually starkly black and white thing is in fact not quite that. I mean, I know it's so easy and straightforward, but I love that.
No, the complications of I think in a lot of ways the complications of a character actually bestows a lot of humanity on them. So when a person does do the noble thing, it's not because they themselves are noble, but because they have made this journey, right, to lead them to nobility. And then at the same time also have that ability to just as quickly turn away from said actions, right? In The Last Jedi, where you start to see Kylo Ren do this good thing and then right back toward the dark side, right? And that's the last we're going to talk about that series. Alan, what you were going to say, we'll go back to it when we talk about things that are awful in our lives. Go on.
Funny that you mentioned that movie. That according to you is a good side of fan fiction, right?
It's just
I know we can talk about that in a couple of minutes, but we have to, I guess. In terms of themes, I mean, to me as a child, right, watching the prequels, right, and then as an early teenager, I think it was 2005. I was in middle school in Veracruz when it came out, Revenge of the Sith, and to me, Anakin, right, was like the archetypical hero, right? I have watched the original trilogy. Luke was always this pure hero, but Anakin seemed like a complex human being, right? As somebody that came from nothing, right, a former slave that gets liberated, joins this magic order of wizards called Jedi, and then all of a sudden has the world to his feet. But the tragedy of power, the tragedy of seduction, the tragedy of seeking to preserve something that's irrevocably lost, right? And not being able to contend with one of the most natural things that every living being, right, in this galaxy or another, far, far away, has to contend with, which is death, right? And how to prevent loss. And to me, that felt a really kind of like a Greek tragedy, right? Of this essential, humanity, ancient kind of like canon, right? How to prevent loss, how to prevent death and pain and suffering, right? And how, in this sense, Sidious and the dark side monopolizes that, right? And manipulates Anakin, aka Darth Vader, Lord Vader, as a puppet to establish the empire and establish the return of the Sith. And that to me has always vibrated with me, because even as a student of history to this day, as faculty member, right, I teach this course when we talk about the echoes of history, right, and it's always the tragedy of people not acknowledging, right, the dangers of being seduced by power and total totalitarian control and all of that, right. And another theme that I want to bring before I pass on the mic is the idea of blindness and complacency, right, from the point of the Jedi Order. And that's why, if I have to say, my favorite Star Wars character is Master Qui-Gon Jinn, because he was one that rejected that vision of order, right, and kind of like protocol, like Mace Windu, for example, played by Samuel Jackson, right, but rather somebody that actually listened to the Force, right, and guided by not his feelings, but just what he considered right. And I think often when we talk about in real world, right, often people's that have become heroes, right, historical figures, are often guided by that inner voice, right, that guides them to the good, rather than following protocol, rather than following order, right, or rather than being seduced by, I don't know, some sort of evil force, right, that offers an easy path, an easy way.
It's funny you bring up Qui-Gon Jinn, because it kind of complements what Alejandra was just saying too, right? He's your favorite character. He's kind of a dick, right? I mean, he's just not a likable guy, right? When you look at it, it's like, here's our protagonist, and he's like, yeah, you're stupid, Jar Jar, and Obi-Wan, stop losing your lightsaber, and I find this kid, and I'm sorry, yeah, I'm gonna rescue your son, but you, Shmi, get to stay here in Tatooine.
Yeah,
I don't know what that has to say about us, because I did want to ask you about your favorite Star Wars characters. You say Qui-Gon. Alejandra, do you have a favorite character?
Yeah, I'm Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan has always been my favorite character.
Now, are you going to go OG Alec Guinness, or are you going to go Ewan McGregor?
I think Ewan McGregor has done such a wonderful role with the character, I have to say. I mean, for me, it was always Alec Guinness. It has to be. It still remains. I mean, I love the hair pieces in different moments and times. I love watching his hair migrate. But there was just like such a wisdom to that knowledge and such an acceptance, but also getting to that point of sort of like the blindness, someone realizing, someone who was blind, right, and realizing too late, sort of like the consequences of like the guilt of like having gone. Sort of again, I'm like, these people need to take some classes on teaching, learn how to teach, learn to know who you're teaching and how to be. But it like really speaks to someone who had a lot of power and tremendous responsibility and failed, like genuinely failed. It went awry. I mean, then we get to see the backstory and we all the stuff that has been added later. We got the series now and all the like, which I'll go on any journey that helps me deal with that. But I like that person late in their life trying to make sense. And what I loved about it is that it'd been a really, in theory, right? We don't know anything before it'd been a really long time since he'd been plugged into any. And when the opportunity comes to like right the wrong, he's like, I'm on it. I'm there. I'm like, 78, but I'm ready to roll. And I was like, wow, where is this coming from? I want that kind of energy for that kind of conviction. But I think that conviction comes right from being wrong and then having to like right that wrong. So I think it's a fascinating character.
I'm with you on the Obi-Wan love. Like, he was always my favorite. I remember reading the novelization of Star Wars when I was a kid. And reading, based on the Journey of the Wills, and reading that Obi-Wan was the perfect Jedi Knight, right? Not the most powerful, certainly among them, but the embodiment of virtue and goodness. And at the same time, here's this lonely hermit who was living his life out, just trying to kind of keeping this eye on this child. But, I got to tell you, as much as hesitant as I was about the prequels, Ewan McGregor has so fully embodied and taken that, and I see these, I know Alan and I follow a lot of the same Star Wars fun account, Stan accounts on Instagram. The love of Ewan McGregor has taken on this whole new aspect, like in the pop culture, zeitgeist. It's like Ewan McGregor has taken that role from Alec Guinness, which I thought had maybe be impossible, but you think about it, he's on screen time far more. I think undoubtedly he's really the center character. Despite what Lucas wanted, he becomes the center character of Star Wars, of the prequel trilogy, and largely of the pop imagination of Star Wars since then. We talk about like it was cool to see Darth Vader in Rogue One, but we were all waiting for this. We were all waiting for like the Obi-Wan series.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing that this guy has kind of taken on this central role, and certainly in the Clone Wars and so forth. So I think it's fascinating. Did either of you though read like the expanded universe stuff, or were you following along with like the comic books or like the novelization? And I'm talking like pre-prequel series, pre-sequels. I'm talking about Timothy Zahn, the Thrawn trilogy. I'm talking the comics. Were either of you into those?
I can say. I mean, I kind of caught up to them older as I got older, but like I've read Tales of the Jedi. I read like the Knights of the Republic series published by Dark Horse Comics. The novels, I think I read one. I can't quite remember the name. I gotta say I've been keeping up more with the new canon, just because I'm trying to keep up a track of what's coming up with the shows and contextualization, everything. I guess that's a historian in me. I have to like really catch up to everything to know everything, I guess. But yeah, I mean, some of those materials, right? I mean, I grew up playing Knights of the Old Republic, so that's just kind of like an incredible story, right?
No, I stayed true to the like just the bit. Not I didn't read extended, and that has created like contention in my household because whenever there's a Star Wars fight, my partner will pull out like, well, according to the books, and then we like becomes another argument about what counts and does not count as canon. So now the internet exists, and we could follow our disputes there. But I think. No, for me, it's just been a love of like watching it as film rather than anything else.
It's funny. There are two things regarding like the canon thing, right? Because so many people were turned off, not necessarily about the sequel series itself, but the fact that they departed from established canon, from getting away from, say, the Thrawn trilogy, from getting away from Jason and Jaina and Anakin Solo. And I remember tweeting one day, there's only one Benjamin, or only one Benjamin, and his parents are Luke and Mara Jade, So there was that. Alan, I'm definitely with you because like my favorite character is actually Ulick Qel-Droma from Tales of the Jedi because he's like really Obi-Wan if Obi-Wan goes bad, right? He's this noble guy who like goes in to tries to undo the dark side from within and just get sucked down, right? And the love triangle or the love story between him and Nomi Sunrider, and people listening to this right now are going, "What the are you guys talking about?"
This has gone into the deep end already.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care. This is my podcast. I can do what I want. So, there was that. But, there's also this thing here that I kind of discovered sometime along the way, because when I kind of stopped watching Star Wars, I'd seen the series so many times. And I started to realize this when I was watching, say, some of the James Bond films, which is I stopped being in love with the films and started to be more in love with the idea of Star Wars than actually what I was seeing on screen myself. Right, because I didn't love the prequels. There were parts, like Alan, you're just talking about like that opera scene when he's talking about
the tragedy of Darth Plagueis.
Well, I think that there are two really great actors in the prequel trilogy. I really think that it's Ewan McGregor. It's also Ian McDiarmid, who is terrific as Palpatine. He really understands that character, really turns that knife in there, right? But like, it was more the idea that I could create Star Wars in my mind, or like the idea of a James Bond kind of world, where versus like what I actually saw, on screen.
I mean, you all are talking. I mean, think about how long it took me to see a woman on screen actually wielding a lightsaber. I mean, I know we will not talk about if you don't like them 789. That's fine, but to me,
I love Rey.
That was such a moment where I was like, "Have I really been waiting this long to see this?"
If you'd read the comics, you would have known about Nomi Sunrider,
I know,
like, who was just amazing, and you would have been ahead of the game well before. I'm just saying. #team Nomi.
But I have to agree with Alejandra in that, right? I mean, I think my gripes with the sequels don't come from the fact of, I guess, like the concept at its core, it's good, but I think the execution of those ideas went horribly bad by the time we reached episode 9. But that's just me. I mean, I remember when I was watching The Last Jedi, right, and we're in the movie theater, and that scene when Luke walks in, I was like, oh, he's gonna wield that green lightsaber, because that was my obsession as a child watching Return of the Jedi. And when I saw the blue one, I was like, where the hell did he got it from, right? Or what's going on here, right? So I think there's some things that were badly executed, but I have to agree with Alejandro on that. Rey, for the concept of Rey, it's like a great concept. I just wish it could have like propelled some more like dynamics to make her a much more interesting character.
I think there was a failure to plan. And again, so if we talk about like the idea that the original trilogy was like what happened, or excuse me, the prequel trilogy is what happened when you published the first draft. Like the sequel trilogy is like when you try to write without an outline. I mean, that's kind of what that is like. We're just going to go with whatever. We'll just find out. But Alan, you do bring up something really important. And this was a thing that I kind of talked about, because Alan and I had a lot of conversations about really how much we love Diego Luna as Andor, Cassian Andor. I've actually said I think he's the second most important guy in Star Wars since the original trilogy, maybe behind Ewan McGregor, especially with this Andor series, which I know you guys are getting caught up on. But like, can we talk a little bit about the idea of representation? Because we all work in Borderlands, which was by very nature a very dynamic place when we talk about race, we talk about backgrounds, we talk about experience and so forth. So the one thing that we were really kind of missing, we had Lando. Okay, there was the one guy, right? The one guy is like, so one of the things that we were desperate for, and I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on, were just how important like these latter series, like we started to get Solo, Rogue One did this tremendous job, and then certainly the sequel trilogy. How important was it to you as fans of film to see the focus on diversifying who we saw on screen and their stories?
So there's a real way in which this conversation always is like, oh, because this is the Star Wars of the now that they needed to do it. And I remember I saw an interview with Carl Sagan right after the first Star Wars. And so it's an interview that he, as a science fiction writer, is doing about, and he gets asked about Star Wars. And he points out, right, in the 1970s, early 1980s, how lack of diverse this world is. So I laugh when I think about, oh, this is like a, Star Wars of the now, or the Star Wars we need. This was a problem that was immediately, right? That was a problem. It was the one scene, right, that, I know we all roll our eyes, but where Leia comforts Luke and you hope and puts his blanket around him. And I remember I was a very angry young feminist from a very young age. I was very young, and
your karate teacher died.
I like rolled my eyes, right? And my dad was like, well, she's supposed to comfort him. And I was just like, what? And I couldn't articulate all the, gender dynamics that were going on at the time, but I think it was there from the beginning, that this tension, right, of the possibility of this world, right? We saw this incredible galaxy with, light speed and blasters and lightsabers. And then at the same time, right, because just like the history reproduces them, it's a reflection of who we are, right? Our imaginations are that we still saw all those things at play. So it was for me, it was representation matters. It's like the stupidest and easiest thing to say, but it really, 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 really does. And I think it was one of those things that I kept hoping, right? I hoped, and really, I was also in line in 1999. I waited in line for a very long time. I could not.
Was it 26 hours?
No, it was not. It was not.
Right.
But I can tell you, it was not in a great town that we went to, because it was the only place we could get tickets for at the last minute. But I waited. It was sort of holding my breath to see the thing that it took really until 2009 to see. And that was very frustrating, right? Like, again, this, as you were talking, Jason, what we love is the story, but also the idea of the story, the possibilities they're in. And I think for me, seeing the series now, seeing these diverse casts, but also diverse stories, right? It's not just about what the character looks like, but what they bring then to that. And I think for me, Rogue One, like I was like, okay, I don't know if I like this movie. I don't know. And Diego Luna, I wanted to know so much more about him. I had so many questions.
So good.
And I think it's because, what he brings to the role, not just his skin color that he brings to the role, but everything else he brings to the role. And I think for me, that's so important, because it gets at that sort of original question of like, not just border stories or stories about conflict, about sovereignty and power, but they're stories that ask us to think, whose story are we telling and who matters? Who are the actors that matter in the story? And I think this diversity that's coming is adding to that answer those questions, which is like that potential that I was so like, I've been holding my breath. And I thank George Lucas for creating this world and inviting us on this ride. But like, I'm so excited the ride has kept going in these ways.
I think I have to agree wholeheartedly with Alejandra. In many ways, to see a Mexican actor represented in the screen, I saw myself in that universe, and that meant everything to me. I mean, the moment I saw him doing the shady meetup with this rebel spy, right, in the rings of Kafrine, he was one of the radicals with Saw Gerrera, and he's like, we were never gonna escape, and he's like, just relax, man, just relax, everything's gonna be fine, and boom, and he just shots the guy, and he's like, I gotta do what I need to do to like make this rebellion happen, right? And it's, I think, a story that really humanizes these characters, right? That there's this really complex things, right? I mean, they're showing this right now in the Andor series, his origins, right? In many ways, it's also and I know Diego Luna talked about it in an interview, this is a migrant story, right? It's a story of perseverance, it's a story of struggle, right? And of realizing how the system works against you, right? And I think that was very, very needed for Star Wars, right? Because it's gonna expand the minds of many of the fans to really understand the perils of this galaxy far, far away and the real world that we live in today.
Well, I want to ask you guys about this because we've kind of keyed in on this a few different times tonight. And this idea of historiography, this background knowledge, things that are pushing these ideas. So I'm kind of wondering if either of you, I don't know if either, please both of you, can speak to maybe 3 or 4 foundational books for you, like what are works for you that really kind of spoke to you or that are kind of in the idea of your own historiography, or maybe even things, because I do want to talk about Weber, Alan, because you and I joke about this so much, about why these things are like why the evolution of historiography is important. There is this huge thing, if you're not familiar, on Twitter, maybe 6-7 months ago, where people get, and this goes around, this idea of historiography. Frankly, I hate writing historiography as a scholar. It's just not a thing. I don't really like talking about other histories. But maybe you guys can and kind of talk maybe about 3 or 4 books, even about either the Borderlands or anything that were particularly influential for you on your own journeys as scholars.
I feel like there's so many, and I just taught a class. I feel like I just successfully taught historiography in my methods class for like the first time in my life, and I couldn't do it through Star Wars. I'm still thinking about how, if any way, I could do it. But I think for the point of historiography, right, it's not just to show that history asks different questions, right, and those questions evolve over time, but how they build and grow and depend on each other, right? And I did it through a very robust historiography, which is the historiography of the American Revolution. So it's very easy. There's a lot of people fighting with each other, but it's not just historians with, bow ties and glasses going, I disagree with this point. It's really building on each other and asking different questions is the most important thing about ideas. It's the most important thing about what people are doing on the ground. And what happens when we look at just this type of sources? What happens when we look at women's sources? What does it do to the revolution? What happens if we look at, enslaved people's voices? What happens? And I think that's what historiography does. It's an evolution of our ideas across time, but it's also an evolution of different ways of approaching sources, including different voices, different actors thinking about representation. Historiography also changes because the academy has expanded in who it includes and which voices it counts. So I think historiography is so much more than the way I was taught, which was it's a history of history, it's debates among historians. And that sounds so boring, and it is so boring, but it's not boring if we think about it sort of foundational building blocks. And I think we all have those books, right, that are just so foundational and important building blocks. If we're going to think about Borderlands, I think about the fact that I did my work at UC Berkeley. This is Bolton's place. This is the first sort of the very early historians that are thinking about the U.S. borders, sort of the U.S. history, but thinking about it in the context of the other Americas, right? And that's so, again, very low bar to thinking, I should think about the hemisphere. I should think about other people in this continent. And I mean, it's a very pro-Spanish history. It's a very, hagiographies of Spanish people who are there, for sure. But the foundation of all that is incredible research and really helping and paving the way for how to do work in the Spanish archives and the Spanish Imperial Archives, something that for me was just sort of groundbreaking. And I had the fortune of going through Bolton's papers, like they're all at the Bancroft, like his research notes. And I remember he does very little work on the Southeast, which is Jason and I, where we work at. And he had this.
You're saying Bolton. Who is Bolton? If people's
Herbert
listening?
Bolton is this really famous historian, and from the 19-teens to 1930s, he becomes a very important professor at UC Berkeley, and really begins what we think of the Spanish borderland schools, really creating stories that are about early people in what's now the United States that are non-Anglos, right? So thinking about Spanish conquistadors, Spanish friars, he is primarily interested in the Spanish influence of early America. But he's also then, as a result, interested in the indigenous people that they interacted with and creates all this history. So I was so enthralled looking at he's an incredibly excellent researcher, right? Apparently he used to research smoking. So he hired grad students to put out his cigarettes because he would just toss them in the archive.
Okay, don't smoke, kids. This is an anti-smoking podcast.
Putting them down. Yeah. So awful. So his papers have like the marks of his cigarettes that he couldn't be bothered to just like put out before he went into the archive. But he took like incredible notes as he's going through these chronicles, in which he makes notes of all the sort of native groups and indigenous groups, and he doesn't know what to do with them, right? He clearly, he doesn't think they're important. He doesn't think they're worth his time, but he clearly sees them and doesn't erase them. So it's this incredible early story where it's a clearly pro-Spanish story that underneath has this like, oh my gosh, I have to deal with indigenous people and I really don't know how. And I think from that tension that he doesn't see as a tension, but anyone who sees him after. And he works with at least two women historians, Mary Ross being one of them, that don't get any credit, that he has just taken a lot of their work and published. Often they're like in a bottom type. It says with Mary Ross, but they did the bulk. I also looked at Mary Ross's papers. Amazing historians who are getting absorbed by male historians' work. And I think Bolton to me was just such a early way of someone trying to reconceptualize the United States, not as a monolith nation, but in fact, I think that was much more fluid. That was like so exciting. But of course, that's very early, and I'm trying to go back in time to think, but there have been many more recent books, I think, of Robbie Etheridge's work in the Southeast, who's just the most important, again, not just because they're telling new stories that I didn't know before, but because they're trying to create ways for us to understand, like paths forward. And I think that's what we all need when we look at books, is help me make sense of this world that looks so weird and different for anything I've ever seen before. And she's just brilliant in that regard.
I can't imagine a Native South field without Robbie Etheridge.
Absolutely not. It doesn't exist.
Like, I know it's like we have as scholars, we have this like love-hate relationship with lists and best and most and stuff like that. But I was saying earlier today, I think I've read every single word she's ever published. I think she's that important.
And that's the thing. I told her one time, your name on my bibliography is the page. Like, I have a page of Robbie Etheridge. Like, it's all you, and it's all relevant, and it's all good.
Yeah, she's amazing. Alan, what about you?
Well, I mean, with my own work and research, borderlands like frameworks, by the time I got into working with Alejandra, I kind of like had to adopt the framework of borderlands, right? Because I have been working with Latin American historians, but thankfully, a lot of the historians of Latin America and Mexico that I kind of like admire, unbeknownst to them, were doing quasi borderlands history, right? Contesting the nation state. And if there is, at least for my field of Afro-Mexican studies, right, the first person scholar who, matter of fact, was not even a historian, but an anthropologist, Mexican anthropologist, Gonzalo Aguirre Beltran. He published a book in the title in Spanish, La Población Negra de México, or Mexico's Black Population, out of the 1940s, which to this day is foundational for the studies of Afro-Mexicans, saying not only, hey, there has been Black people in Mexico since the beginning, but not only let me tell you they exist, but let me tell you where they're from and their history too, right? And it was the first scholar that kind of did this history. Another scholar that really looked up to more in terms of 19th century revolutions, Latin America, particularly Mexico, out of UC San Diego. He just became emeritus. Eric Van Young, his book, The Other Rebellion, in attributing agency, right, and power to indigenous peoples and peasants in Mexico's War of Independence, gave me that framework to really understand these populations from another perspective that's not from the top down, rather from the down upward, that I could apply to Afro-Mexican populations where I study in Veracruz. And I would say a third foundational book, another Mexican historian, not American historian. His name is Antonio Garcia Leon, and he published a 900-page book, right? So Weber-like material, right? It's called Tierra Adentro, Mar en Fuera, or Land Inland, an Ocean Outside, right? And it's a complete history from 1519 all the way to 1822 of the port city and its surroundings, right? And it goes through economics, development of capitalism, African slavery. I mean, it's an insane amount of material. And Alejandra knows this. I've only gone through that book for like the first 500 pages. I still have like 400 pages more to read. But this is a guy that is not only a historian, but also an ethnomusicologist and a linguist as well, right? Who has this formation of really taking history and looking at it from a different perspective. And I think these three scholars, four scholars, I'm forgetting, of course, about one of the books that shaped me as a scholar, also the approach of the African diaspora, and that's Julius Scott with The Common Wind, whose book was barely published in 2018. It was a dissertation that he published in the early 1980s, and everyone, right, cited the dissertation, but the actual book was just published by him in 2018, right? The Common Wind. It's an excellent book that I recommend to everyone. And talking about Star Wars, it has a little bit of that kind of like underground, kind of like networks of communication that the Rebel Alliance in Star Wars will use. This is a book about free and enslaved African descendants in the Spanish, British, and French colonial possessions, right? Trying to find avenues of freedom and resistance inspired by the Haitian Revolution. And I think all these four authors that I share with you right now, Jason, really provide kind of like this approach of not looking at one specific place through the lens of the nation, but rather to look at it through the lens of human agency and movement and effort and hopes and dreams. And I think that is the kind of school of historiography that has shaped me, the one that situates humanity at its center, not the nation or an empire, right, or colonial possessions, but human beings and ways to circumvent their current circumstances.
All right. Well, let me ask you this. We're going to dance around. Let's jump in. Let's talk David J. Weber, because we've already talked about Bolton, right? Which, for those of you who don't know, Bolton begats Weber, right? Historiographically, I think Weber was his student, was he not? Was he under Bolton, or was he just influenced by him? I don't know off the top of my head. But Alan, you and I like tease each other back and forth. I think The Spanish Frontier in North America is like maybe one of my favorite books. You tease me back about Weber. Was Weber Empire? Is he Rebellion? Is he somewhere in the middle? Where do you like him?
I'm gonna get into so much trouble. Weber is the ISB, the Imperial Security Bureau in the Empire. He's setting up the borders. He's setting up the structure. He's setting up the delineations of the field. To me, right? I mean, Weber provides such a bountiful background, right? I mean, I'm not discrediting Weber, right? But I feel he's the product of his time, right? And he's a product of the context of his time. And I think the types of history that I like to do, try to, of course, let's look at Weber, but let's see what else we can do by looking past this context, right? And I'm obviously joking. I don't want to start a war in the Twitterverse about associating Weber to the Empire.
Believe me, there'll be something shiny that they can argue with at some point in time. But doesn't like actually? So those thoughts on Weber, don't they kind of make the point, Alejandra, for this idea of the additive historiography? I mean, where you just kind of take that and go to the next place, or what are your thoughts?
I don't know. Like, I'm just trying to think very in this dichotomous line, of empire versus. So
No, I'm creating borders.
You're creating borders.
I'm creating borders.
I'm just trying to think what was so I mean, David Weber, Alan said, he's very much like right, a product of his time, right? But I think more, he's Galen Erso, right? He's right, he's setting up. He is working for the empire in many ways, but he's not, right? He's setting up the possibility of destruction of that very empire. So if I can be like very specific, because
God, that was smooth. That was really good.
I feel like this is not the space, but I feel like I do know this. I love this stuff so much. So I think, Weber's definitely trying to think about empire, and he's definitely thinking through this model. But he is not interested in that empire at all. He's interested in everything else. And I think he's very early on trying to think of not just the Spanish perspective or the Catholic perspective, but the local perspective on the ground, the Texas perspective, the Tejano perspective. That's still not indigenous at all, right? But it's indigenous of the place and has that experience. And I think he sets it all up for everyone that comes in his wake in a very powerful way. So I think of, I just think of this book that was produced in his sort of as an honor to him, because after he passed away, and it's a book by Juliana Barr and Edward Countryman. I think it's Contested Spaces, right? And
Yes.
This book is the most, I've definitely participated and we've collaborated in anthologies, but this anthology is just one of those things that I just think about all the time when I think about Borderlands. This is the one I go to. It's the one I think I made Alan read. I think it's the one, just because
I used it in my work. Yeah.
I used it in my work.
Yeah.
Yes, but to me, the bottom of that, right, is David Weber, right? It's not just because it's in his honor, but it's what he is able to create. And often that initial first step doesn't look as pretty as we want it to do, is not as shiny, but it opens up this possibility, right? So that's where I stand on Weber. The work itself is very much a product of its time, but it leads to such incredible potential. And I think bad work doesn't do that, right? It just doesn't. It doesn't get read. It forecloses opportunities not opened. And that's not what this work does. To me, it's foundational, not because we all rest on it, but because of like the past, like the little window it opened for all of us to like jump through and destroy the empire afterwards.
Yeah, I will never ever be able to look at the bookshelf over my right shoulder in the same way again. I'm like, you blew up Alderaan, you son of a...
I wasn't too far off.
Let's bring this back to Star Wars here. I know, right? All right, so I'm going to make us rank. Now, there are 11 films in the Star Wars universe, and we're going to have to go for your personal, professional 11-1. We've got the Holy Trilogy, Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. Some people might refer... Do you call Star Wars A New Hope, or do you just call it Star Wars? I just kind of call it New Hope just for
clarity.
Doing this, and Star Wars is the thing, right? And of course, we've got episodes 1, 2, and 3, 7, 8, 9, and then we've got Solo and Rogue One. And then we're going to set aside Andor and Obi-Wan and all the other ancillary stuff, because there's some really cool stories. Alan, where are you going to go? Give me number 11. What's your least favorite, worst Star Wars film?
I gotta say Episode 9, Rise of Skywalker, because I had such high hopes for it to conclude the Skywalker saga, and I was just very, very disappointed in the execution of that. I mean, really, we're not gonna get a Force Ghost. Really, we're not gonna get Force Ghost as Rey is like laying down, right? I mean, it's that kind of like experience, right? It's kind of like wanting more that makes me unfortunately put it at number 11 for me.
Alejandra, what you got? What's your number 11?
Episode 2.
Really? You're gonna go Attack of the Clones?
Wow.
All right. Why clones? Why clones? Because do you not also do you like sand? Is that?
I mean, I love it. It gets everywhere. No, it's just I watched it recently, and there are so many redeeming qualities of Episode 1. And again, like Alan, I had such hope for Episode 1, such hope. But there's still moments that really I still do enjoy, like from the lightsaber scene to the music score, that I could listen to that scene without watching it and enjoy it in good ways. That I feel like with Episode 2, I struggle to find things that I will voluntarily want to watch it again.
Yeah, there are components of Episode 2 that are fun, right? The idea of Obi-Wan doing a detective story, like you could see where Lucas, again, where he was shooting for something and just couldn't quite stick the landing, right? and I'll wait till Andrea gets to episode 9, but I do want to say, maybe the redeeming quality of episode 9 of The Rise of Skywalker is that finally it ends, it's over, and it can't hurt us anymore. I feel like maybe that might be
There is a point.
the best part. Yeah. All right, Alan, what's your next one here? What do you got?
Number 10, I would say Solo, Star Wars story. I really, and here's the thing, you're putting me through the binder here. This is really, really hard for me to do because I love Star Wars. I love everything that comes out. I don't hate Star Wars. I love, and you know me. You both know me. How much I always like. Oh my God, Star Wars! I consume it. Right, just put it in an IV and like inject it. Right, but Solo to me, felt like a.
I have to say that I don't think I ever told. So you were in my class. We had just met. And we were going up to my office to get like a book or something after class.
Yeah.
You're wearing a jacket and your jacket had the Rebel insignia. And I was like, how do I get this guy?
It's my guy.
To like, how do I get him to work with me? Like, that was such a moment. I'm like, I don't know what to work on. We haven't really met, but like, I already know that this is going to be a good.
It was Destiny Master.
For those of you who can't see, Alejandra's wearing a Star Wars hoodie right now. And drinking out of something that looks like a large gallon of mustard.
Blue milk.
Blue milk.
All right, Alejandra, what do you got? What's your number 10? We can cruise through these.
Oh my goodness. Okay. I'll say episode 9.
Okay, so we all agreed that Rise of Skywalker is bad.
It was so frustrating.
Yeah.
All right. And what about your number? And Alejandra, what about your number? Oh wait, it's 11, 10. What's your next worst?
1.
Really? All right. Wow, you are not a prequel fan.
I am not. No.
The pacing on those is really bad.
Yep. And I give them ample chances every year. Like I said, I try it again.
The CGI hasn't held up on those at all.
And I always think about the fact that The Matrix came out 2 weeks before episode 1. And I always think about the fact that blew all of our minds or that blew my mind. And then I was like, what is this other movie that I'm going to go see?
We kind of talked our way, I think, remember in 99, we were kind of talking. It was like, no, it was good, right?
It was good. I liked it.
You want to watch again? No, I don't. Right, Alan. What about you? What's your what's in your number 9 slot?
Force Awakens.
Okay, why?
I really like Force Awakens, but I think there's a better movie that had been done before. It's called A New Hope. Force Awakens. It's A New Hope reloaded. It's like Fast and the Furious, right? It's like family. It's like a movie that's really good, and I love Kylo Ren. I love that character, right? And we talked about this, but I don't know, just the concept of the evil new refashioned First Order and the new weapon is twice as big. That's all right. It's just I don't know. I just expected something more epic from that trilogy. You know.
I think if we'd done our homework and see, because we were all excited about J.J. Abrams at the time, and what we see is that Force Awakens is really his version of what he did with the Star Trek film, which was really to kind of dumb things down to a mass audience. It was a sign that you just simply didn't trust the audience with a new story. And yeah, in a lot of ways, if people aren't familiar with like the Dark Empire comic series, one of the things that drove me nuts about some of the Star Wars Expanded Universe stuff, and this is prequels, everything kind of came out in like these books and comics, like here comes the newest version of the Death Star. Mm-hmm. Right. One of the things I think Andor does so well is we don't see the super weapon. The Empire is the super weapon.
Yes.
Right. The unrelenting pressure of this force, not mystical, but like of this government authority that is just never stops, right? So, all right, you got Force Awakens. What's next, Alan? I'm just kind of snaking my way through here.
Number 8, correct? We're in 8.
At some point in time, we'll start liking these films.
You hate this movie, but this is my favorite of the sequels, and still ranks number 8, The Last Jedi, number 8. And here's the thing: for all the horrible parts about that movie, I think there is something, the smallest thing that is redeemable about that movie is that I think...
Is it Princess Leia as Mary Poppins?
No, I hate that part. I really hate that part about the movie. But I would say it's a kind of like dark aura that's forming around Rey and her freaking out about like what's going on with me.
Is it the slowest chase sequence in film history?
It's not. It's not as well.
Is it your mom joke in the Star Wars?
It's not. Well, yeah, that was a new thing, rather. Yeah, that was a new thing.
Is it the gambling scene that doesn't do anything?
Yeah, I guess. But
all right, I'm sorry. I'll stop.
No. I gotta say, the only good thing about that is that it showed me Luke Skywalker being Jedi to the core in terms of fighting Kylo Ren. He never attacked Kylo. He never swung his blade against him. He was just dodging him, right? And it was like a good serve, right? As we say in Latin America, it was a slap with a white glove to Kylo Ren.
A
And
what?
a slap with a white glove, cachetada con guante blanco, which means basically, I don't know how to explain
It's
this.
like the chivalry thing, right?
No, we've seen it like in the like yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of like being the better person, right? And I think
Right.
that embodied Luke Skywalker from the original trilogy, right? He is the better Jedi. He is the better human in this. But that's about it.
Okay. Alejandra, what do you got? What's your number 8?
Probably Solo.
I'm assuming you don't like Solo.
It wasn't I loved Lando. I wanted a Land. By the time I had seen that, I was like, I want the Lando movie. I don't know what this is, but this is not. I thought I felt like the actor. I'm blanking on his name. He did he did a great job. But all the characters, the first characters, like the Woody Harrelson crew, I was like, I want that movie. Whatever that is, that's the movie I thought I would.
Yeah.
So they were all
Well, the pre-Ron Howard gets hired, like when they fired the original directors, the Miller and Lord.
I know. It's this cowardness of the universe, right? That you see happening over and over again. Like, we're gonna do something cool, not so cool, not so cool. We're gonna take it.
They don't trust the audience, and that's been my biggest problem with the Kathleen Kennedy Star Wars universe. Is like it just doesn't trust. There are parts of Solo that are really cool, but like, do you have to hit me over the head and say, "Oh, you don't have a last name"? So no, okay, we know that he's got a last name. It comes from all the. No, okay, he's Carillion. The Solo line is actually well established. It's like no, yeah, and there were other parts of Solo, like, but there were also like Chewie going ape shit. Yes, now we get to see Chewie rip someone's arm off. That's what I want to see, right? But weird Lando robot love triangle, no. But the fact that like that droid ends up as the Falcon's
That was cool.
CPU, that's cool. Like there were moments of Solo where you're like, oh, you got it. Yeah, you didn't. It's like sticking landing and falling down. They were so close at times. What's your next one? What's your number 7, Alejandra?
Probably I'm whatever the prequels I'm missing. I'm probably missing episode 3.
You were missing 3. You're missing Revenge of the Sith.
3. Yeah. I mean,
3.
I have to say that my favorite thing about the prequels, though, is I actually watched episode 1 twice in the movie theater. The second time we took my dad. And the best part about, as my brother and I were trying to convince each other that we liked this movie that we didn't, in fact, love the first time around. The best part was my brother goes, well, it's just so unbelievable that little kid's going to become Darth Vader. And my dad like slams on the brakes. He goes, what? That kid is Darth Vader? And that was the closing of our lives. We still talk about the fact that my dad did not know that was coming. And so I think that always, it's always the experience, right, of Star Wars too, that elevates these movies is who you watch them and the conversations you have. And I always think about the prequels in that particular moment.
Well, that brings up a good question, right? Like, Alejandro, you've got kids. Alan, you don't yet, but like, how do you introduce these films? Do you introduce in what order? Do you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, or do you start with A New Hope and kind of go with the big reveal in Empire?
We started early and often, and we started with New Hope. And then we tried the prequels, and the verdict was they're okay, but the boring parts are so boring.
So boring.
And I think they're kids of the now. You have kids, Jason, so they're really used to like a very quick TikTok, YouTube, very finite kind of thing that moves quickly. So, I mean, J.J. Abrams really captures that, whether you like it or hate it. He works on the television series of like 30-minute switch, 30-minute switch, 30-minute switch, which, really captures, at least for my kids, really captures their attention and then propels them to the next one. So, for me, they like the originals. New Hope and so forth. And then I think they enjoy, episode 9, as much as I don't like it, I could take my kids to the movie theater to watch it. And that was exciting for them. It was like the first Star Wars they could go to the movie theater. Then we were all a little bit disappointed and shocked, but it was like the one movie we could all go together.
I'm a little worried you haven't brought up The Last Jedi yet, Alejandro.
I like it. I like that movie, and I can fight about it. I like it.
All right, Alan, give me your number 7 and 6. We're gonna get there in a moment when you'll finally get there. I don't want to keep you guys here all night, but like I'm going to get us through this list. Alan, give us 7 and 6. What's your next order?
7 and 6. Number 7 is gonna be Attack of the Clones. For me, when I was a kid, I was 10 years old when that came out, and to me, to see Camino and the clones and just this idea of having a clone army, right? That some mysterious force just created. I was like, whoa, what's going on here? Obi-Wan, I was equally as freaked out as Master Kenobi was in that film, man. We have Jedi, right, in action in Geonosis. You have the Grand Army of the Republic. There's a lot of salvageable moments about the film, but ultimately it's in my 7 because of the script. I think Phantom Menace has much better dialogue than Attack of the Clones, and that for me makes a Phantom Menace, of course, not Jar Jar, right? But to me, the fact that like Qui-Gon, right, is this master that when Obi-Wan, even though for being a bit of what
Are you going Phantom Menace at number 6?
Number 6, Phantom Menace, and to me, I mean, it was just this kind of like the defiance of Qui-Gon against Mace Windu, saying he is the chosen one. Can you see this? Like, and they're like, no, we have rules and protocols and regulations to follow for new children to enter the Jedi Order, right? But his belief in that, to me, it's like foundation, right? Believing in this slave kid that was Anakin Skywalker becoming a Jedi and liberating everyone in the galaxy, that to me was like a hope, right? And of course, to me, I'm gonna get in hot water right here, but that movie has the best lightsaber fight in all of Star Wars movies. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan Kenobi versus Darth Maul.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so
Maul and Obi-Wan, absolutely.
Yeah,
no doubt.
And even Qui-Gon with Darth Maul as they're walking down the hallway, right, in the generators of Naboo. I mean,
the whole disrobing thing, and then the music. Remember, the music comes on, and it's Duel of Fates. It's like, I'll still just like, oh yeah, no,
I'm getting
that is
right now.
That I am too, right? That's the infuriating part of the prequels, is that there are moments when they get it.
Yep.
And that fight is so much better and so much more infused. You know, you watch the original like Obi-Wan and Luke versus Vader and stuff like that. Very much wooden broadsword.
Right.
This is very Japanese in origin. Like, so they're pulling this stuff. It's much more acrobatic. It's beautiful. Alejandra, what do you got? What's your number 6? Please, God, get to a sequel trilogy.
Yes, okay.
At some point in time.
Well,
So
my 5 and 6 are right, Episode 8, right, The Last Jedi, and then The Force Awakens.
Whoa, you're going Last Jedi at 6?
Yep.
Okay, that's. I mean, it's wrong, but it's it's so. Okay, here's my fundamental problem with Last Jedi is they ultimately get Luke's character wrong, and even Hamill came out and said this before. Like, someone at Lucasfilm was like, "Hey, could you not dog Last Jedi?" I just like this angry part of him just didn't seem. I mean, and it seemed like too much of a rehash of like what we saw with Obi-Wan. Oh, he's a hermit now. I mean, I don't know. But tell me what you liked about Jedi, and then I'll be quiet and I'll move on. What did you like about The Last Jedi?
What I like the possibility of a new direction that then was immediately forced closed, but I love the fact that we were not going to be in the same universe we were always in. I like the side characters, even though the quest was frustrating and did nothing. I liked Emily Train's character. I was like, I want to know more about this, this young woman who lost her sister. I was into those characters. And I was into the fact that like these very important, pronounced general woman takes the lead and immediately gets called into question, right? Immediately she's not wearing the right things. We're already doubting her. And she gets called into question. And of course she ends up being right and a badass. But it's one of those things I'm like, man, do women need to die in this universe to be listened to? Yes, I think it's so far the answer, unfortunately.
I actually like Holdo. She was one of my favorite parts of the
I like
that.
That's what
I think she should have killed Leia.
I was like, I'm for this, I'm for this character.
And the scene where Holdo goes into hyperspace, that was cool.
So
that
cool.
was visual.
So cool.
Cinema.
Rian Johnson can frame a scene. Parts of the film are amazing. Parts are not. You had Force Awakens. Alan, what do you got at 5?
And okay, my last 5 are kind of like the whole scale changed because of Rogue One. I'm not gonna reveal where Rogue One is, right? And that is the hardest choice. I'll get. It's not Rogue One. My number 5 is not Rogue One by any means.
I see that,
but it's actually the last of the original trilogy because it's so hard for me to rank them. Yeah, Jedi, and I tell you why. It's perhaps my most favorite original trilogy movie because Luke's green lightsaber is my favorite lightsaber ever. But I don't know.
Very specific.
It's right, but it's also I like the Ewoks, but I don't know, man. The Ewoks defeating the Empire as we see in the Empire, right? It just seems kind of like I get the message of that, but I don't know. It's just hard, right, to rank them with New Hope and an Empire, which I think they're better than Jedi, right? Higher. You're putting me through like the binary here, Jason. Like I'm getting into trouble just because I need to rank this, right? But
you need to decide. You need to make it. You need to make a decision, and this is literally what your entire PhD training taught you to be: was to come up with a thesis statement and then back it up with an argument.
5 is Jedi.
All right, what do you got as 4?
Hope.
Whoa!
Yeah.
All right.
And I love A New Hope. I love A New Hope. But here's the thing. I still think that Empire ranks better than Hope.
All right.
As a film.
Well, we got 3 films remaining. So Alejandra, what do you got at 4?
So at 4, I have Return of the Jedi, and then at 3, I have Rogue One.
Okay, all right. See, this is where I think that a lot of people started to think, because I started to think about this recently too, in terms of like, I think a lot of us starting to feel like 5 years in, how do we feel about Rogue One? And I got to tell you, the more I find it to be the most rewatchable of any of the films.
So I'll tell you, I went to see it in the movie theater. I got a babysitter. This is like a very rare occurrence to get to see Star Wars in the movie theater. And I came out of that movie and I was like, I don't know how to feel about this movie. I don't know if I liked it. And,
That's good.
And everyone was like, what's wrong with you? It's the best. And I was like, I got to sit with this movie. And it took a rewatching. I mean, I got to say, I came out very mixed to bad. And it's been probably the movie I rewatched the most, that I've now used in my history class, that has like stuck with me by far the most.
I wonder, after watching the Andor series, if this stops being a Jen Erso movie and starts being Cassian Andor's movie.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I think it's still a Jen Erso film, but the Erso Andor relationship is the best romance we've had since Han and Leia. It's just far and away. I mean, just organic and real. And that last scene when they're looking at each other and they know they're not going to make it out, and you're like, oh, you found each other, and now it ends. And they had to die. They have to die. Everyone has to die in Rogue One. It's the best decision they've made. This film does not work unless all the good guys die. Everybody who goes down to Scarif dies. Works. All right. Alan, what you got at 3?
I'm going to say Rogue One as well. Rogue One.
Okay, you both have Rogue. Okay.
And
at 2?
At 2, Empire. Empire Strikes Back at number 2.
Wait a second.
Yep. I'm being controversial right now, guys. I know.
You are.
And I'm going to have to defend myself as a good historian on my number 1.
Oh, what happens here?
You want me to tell number 1? Or
No. I want Alejandra to say her number 2, and then you can both blurt out your number 1, and I can choose who we're friends with afterwards.
My number 2 is New Hope.
Right.
That is correct.
Okay, that's fine. That's good. And 1 is
Empire.
It's got to be Empire. All right, Alan, what are you going to say? It's really weird and wrong.
Well, it's a generational thing, my friend, and I'm entitled to my opinion. But as a historian of Latin America, this is the history of every Latin American republic or Spanish American republic, and it's Revenge of the Sith. Is the tragedy of a republic. Is the fall of the dreams of a united people monopolized by an authoritarian government. It's the tragedy of this poster child that was going to liberate everyone and then just crumbles and dies to the ground. And you have to understand.
It's a tragedy of the podcast right now is what it is.
Listen, I'm entitled to my fan opinion here, but like, you tell me there's any. I think the emotional aspect of Order 66 is up there with Rogue One. When they're when they're betraying all the Jedi in the field and they start shooting them from the back, right? And the start. I mean, it's heavy stuff, right? It's heavy things, right? Like they're killing younglings and they're shooting Jedis and they go to the temple and race to the ground. It's heavy material, right, for Star Wars, and I think it meant Star Wars digestible for a larger audience than just young teenagers and children. I think that's what I like about that film, because I think it challenges the viewer to really lose hope for a bit in a franchise that's built on the idea of hope and heroism.
You don't get a Darth Vader without a full on heel turn. He's got to go evil, and the evil's got to be like. That's the reason why it's so important to see him walk in there with the room with younglings and ignite his lightsaber. He's got to do things that are beyond redemption, which makes Luke's efforts so much better.
Absolutely.
All right, so we've got Return of the Sith. Revenge of the Sith and Empire. Okay, both movies ended on giant downers, which probably explain everything we need to know about us as humans, our relationship as friends, our choice of films. All right, let me ask you one last question because I've kept you way too long already. Alan and Alejandra, is Star Wars a history film?
In many ways, right? So in the obvious ways that historians always say everything has a history, right? So in the fact that like we can trace the evolution from effects to people, to its own story and the things that are pushing it. We talked about representation. We talked about the things that are pushing the story forward in time. But it's also a story that tries to create and live through its own mythology. And even though fans will all fight about, they got this wrong, they got this thing wrong, it's a world, right, that tries very much to say this, right? It begins, right? The New Hope begins with sort of talking about it before time, a before time of peace. And in that time of peace, there's also a before time of like disorder. So there's always an understanding that things really change and radically change. And human agency is critical, right, to that change. And so are ideas, and so are taxes, and so are policies, and I think the historian in me is like, yes, that's exactly right. That's all the things. And we need multiple people to study them and watch them and fight about what is that matters more.
Yeah, I have to second Alejandra. I don't think Star Wars is just a history movie. I think it's many history movies. Star Wars is Asian history. It's ancient history. It's the history of colonization, the history of decolonization. It's the history of slavery. It's the history of freedom. It's the history of resistance, right? There's many histories here that are associated with Star Wars. And I think that's what Lucas is such a genius for creating this playground, right? Where different directors now, different writers can draw upon human experience, like Alejandra was sharing with us, and make it more complex, right? And it can go right from like Kurosawa, Japanese inspired films, to Sergio Leone, Italian films from the 60s on the West, to martial arts films influencing Rogue One, or even The Bourne Identity, right, influencing Rogue One as well, spy thrillers, James Bond, right? So it's many different aspects, it's many different histories, and I think that's why Star Wars should be studied by historians in comparative sense as well.
Look, I'm not going to disagree with either of you, because I think that even though Marvel has obviously gone on and become even bigger with the more films and the world building and things like that, that doesn't happen without Star Wars. I think Star Wars is actually the single most important film franchise in film history. For me, it certainly as a guy who grew up in the 1970s and 80s, it was crucial to my identity, the way I understood good versus evil, nobility, and like why I didn't have a girlfriend and all these different things. But yeah, so. No, I think you guys have, and I do love your idea. Like, yeah, it's many history films, right? It's so much you can take from these things. So I could talk to you guys about this all day. I definitely want to come back after we've done Andor, if you guys have seen it, because there's this conversation I think that's revolving around Andor that's absolutely changing Star Wars right now, and actually changing how we talk about like
episode 10.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. So, all right, guys, thank you so very, very much. I cannot thank you enough for believing in this podcast, your friendship, and the many conversations we've had in the years that we've known each other, just not only just about Star Wars, but about history and just any number of things. Like, if you're listening right now, I cannot tell you how much I value both of these people as my friends. They are just amazing. Go out and read their stuff. They are just the best human beings. They are definitely on the side of the rebellion here. I think maybe. Alan and Alejandra, where can we find you guys online? Where can people find you guys?
I am on Twitter, but I don't know where Twitter is right now. So I'm not on Twitter right now, but I'm very easy to find in my department website, and I answer emails as quickly as I possibly can. So I'm always an email away to talk about Star Wars or to talk about grad school if you have questions that I can answer, both about Riverside specific or just general. I just got a really nice email from someone who I talked to who didn't come to Riverside. I don't think he ended up even applying, but we talked about grad school in general, and I love doing that as well.
Alan, what about you?
I used to be on the Twitterverse, but it seems that I escaped it just in time, right? Just kidding. But yeah, like Alejandra, you can find me on my faculty profile at Washington State University. I'm always an email away. If you have a question, like Alejandra said, about Star Wars, about grad school at W State, WSU or not, I'm usually a friendly helper when it comes to choosing your destiny, as Emperor Palpatine used to say. So yeah, thank you, Jason, for having us.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you guys so very much.
And may the Force be with you.
And may the Force be with you.
Always.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you all so much for joining in and listening today. Thank you to our guests, Alejandra Dubcovsky and Alan Malfavon. Thank you, of course, always to our producer, Fletcher Powell. And if you want to learn more about HATM, Historians of the Movies, you can follow me on Twitter at Herbert History or look for the hashtag HATM. And folks, if you want to keep building this movement, please do like, subscribe, and share this podcast with everybody you know, including your best friends, including your enemies, and yes, everyone else in between. So thank you so very, very much for coming in, and we will see you a little bit later. Bye.